Hello viewers, and welcome back to Phil and Jen in the Philippines on Phil. Before we start, hit the subscribe button, the notification bells, the thumbs up, thumbs down, depending on what you get out of this particular video. And must remember to look at the lens. And thank you everybody for subscribing to date. Well, as requested in the last video, I asked everybody regarding commenting on whether or not they wanted to hear about a number of businesses I'd started here in the Philippines, and for various reasons why they either succeeded or failed. Some did succeed in varying lengths and heights and breadths, but the majority of them failed. Now, I'll preface everything and give you the background and some of the considerations I didn't take in, and some of the reasons, or all the reasons that I can think of off the top of my head, why these particular businesses failed. The first one, I'm going to start off with the biggest and the best, or the biggest and the worst, which was the first business that I partook of in the Philippines, and give you the reasonings and how it came about. My wife and I, or my now wife, and I were living in Thailand, and we, through circumstances, decided to return to her home in Mitum, which is in the southern area of Mindanao, about 125 kilometers west of General Santos. Now, for the first 2 years that we'd returned, and one of the reasons we'd returned, we'd decided to get married, and I had, knowing a little bit about Asian cultures, to ask permission from her father, who, in an awkward situation, was only probably 4 years or 3 years older than myself, for his daughter's hand in marriage. But it is the right thing to do in Asia, is to ask permission, and I had no reason to believe that he would deny that permission, and it's just a mark of respect. So we returned to the Philippines. We did reside in a rented premises in General Santos City in Camilla, and we used to commute very regularly out to Mitum. We possessed a car, we bought a car, and then we used to travel to Mitum. Now, we'll start at the start as far as that business is concerned. In this area, when it comes to conjugal land, which is land owned by the family or the head of the family that is expected to be passed on to the children after his death, the majority under their beliefs is that the majority of that land goes to the boys. And the reasoning behind that is they suspect that one day the girl will marry and the girl will go over to the husband's family, and he will have been taken care of by his family through land and whatever, and land's very important here. But my wife was in her very late 30s, and she had 2 brothers, and she had expressed a desire to have some land because she was a widow. She had a couple of kids, which the parents were looking after, and they had agreed that she could choose a parcel of land, but she hadn't made that choice. She did have her eye on a property which was considered to be a terrible property, which was a beachside property that had been an old tilapia pond that was now in disrepair, and it had virtually turned into a swamp. So she chose that piece of property after realising that, being in Thailand and being in other parts of Asia, that beachfront property is good to develop. She showed me the property. I looked at it, and all I could see, even though it was a swamp and an old tilapia farm, that it had possibilities with a little bit of invested income. So it was agreed that she could have that piece of land, and we decided, or I decided rather enthusiastically, that that's where I'd build the house for her, and that's where we resided, or would reside. What happened next was, obviously, we started to fill that particular land in, and the dump truck started to come, and there was a great deal of activity and money spent just filling in that land. Everyone thought we were absolutely insane, why we wanted to choose this, what they consider to be crappy block of land to build our house. But of course, being from the West and coming from a country like Australia where beachfront property is very desirable. I was enthusiastic. I was cashed up. I had a lot of money at that stage of the game, and I was enthusiastic about it. And to very much their surprise, we spent a huge amount of money, not huge for me, but a huge amount of money for them, filling in this land. So at the end of the day, we had the land. And at this particular point in time, what I hadn't realised was that my wife was the sole income earner when she was working overseas for a period of 11 years in UAE and then in Thailand. And she was sending money home and approximately $1,000 a month. And they had become very comfortable with that income. So when I came onto the scene, that money stopped because I encouraged her, because when I met her she was physically exhausted because of the 11 years of work, and her situation as far as I could see wasn't good. So being the white knight, I said, baby, give this away. We don't need it. I can definitely support you. My liquidity is such that you don't have to work. So I convinced her to give that particular employment away and come under my wing, because I saw a future for us. She did that very hesitantly, and of course the money going home dried up, or at least she supplemented that money that used to go home, unbeknownst to me, from her savings turn up. So what had happened then was that as her money from her savings diminished over a period of time, she still felt the obligation to support her family. Now, at this stage, I'd met the family. They were a great family, but did not realise the level of support she was giving, and more importantly, did not realise the level of debt. And this is a debt-motivated society, especially in rural Peruks and in the provinces, and how indebted they were to third parties. And all of a sudden, the money had dried up. So then I quickly came to realise that I was subsidising through requests money to the family. Now, being the Westerner that I was and the ignorance that I was, my immediate reaction was, how do I get out of a situation where financially it was becoming a burden on me? Not a great burden, but it was annoying that every time I came to the door there was a minor a problem or a fairy tale or a story to obtain funds. I don't hold that against them, because I was partially responsible for them not obtaining the funds that they'd become so used to. So I continued. So one of the reasons I looked around after I'd finished the land, before I'd built the house, and that was the next big decision, to start with the house, what to do. So I devised a plan. I thought to myself, I'm going to develop a business that they can all be employed in, of some description, and that would ease the burden if they were making money. A rather simplistic plan, a rather ill thought out plan, but the theory was there, and it's something that, had I been in the West, would have been a great assistance to my family had I done the same thing. And I just immediately assumed it would be a great assistance to theirs if they could all work and they could obtain an income. Now remember this, I said in a couple of other videos, the family still don't know me. And yes, I had been given permission to marry the daughter, and yes, I was Johnny on the spot and the new guy, and yes, they accepted me with open arms, and yes, all of these things, I was feeling very comfortable. But they didn't really know my intentions, and it's very easy to say what you're going to do, but money talks and actions talk and bullshit walks. And at this stage I hadn't proved any of that. So I was determined to prove that what I'd told these people I was going to fulfill. We started. The way to do it, I thought, because I don't know the area and these people live here, was to sit down with the family and ask them what a reasonable business would be. Now remember this, traditionally they're farmers, and they were farming plots of land for some meagre return, and they weren't paupers within their own areas by any means. They were landowners. They were held in relatively high regard within their own Peruks, and they were trundling along with their lives quite comfortably, but still subject to the old debt thing that occurs here in the Philippines, and they were living hand to mouth, day to day, week to week. Not an unusual situation here in the Philippines, but one could put it down as poor middle class because they were landowners. So I sat down with them and I put the question out there, hoping to get an immediate response. Well, we went through a number of ideas. A lot of them I just dismissed because it was more enthusiasm coming out than reality. You know, this would be good and that'd be good. And the things that they were suggesting just weren't too basic to provide a company structure or a business structure that would provide enough money for the two brothers, their families, and my father-in-law and then his wife. So it had to be relatively big. Now, I'm going to say this too before I even start. The plan was override the business, manage the business until it got to a situation, and I had full intentions of handing the entire business over to the family once it was up and running and once I was comfortable with the fact that they would continue. This meant a considerable investment, but hey, it was going to be the family that I was going to spend in one shape or another the rest of my natural life with, and it was my wife's family. So I was ready, willing and able to invest what was considered to be a lot of money over here to make sure that my family was set up and I wouldn't have the added mental burden of those particular people continuously knocking on the door and requesting money, not so much from me, but putting pressure on my wife to obtain funds or help or assistance. That was the thinking behind it. As I said, we went through a number of suggestions. Now, you've got to know the area. Miitum and around General Santos is basically two things, farming and fishing. And the more I learned about the fishing industry, and there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of small traditional Filipino boats that go out and fish for numerous types of fish, mainly pelagic fish, mackerel and this type of thing. And then from certain times in the month, they would fish for posset. Now, when they were fishing, the icing on the cake was if they hooked and obtained a tuna. A tuna was very highly regarded, paid a lot of money, and of course, if they were lucky enough to hook a tuna, that was a windfall financially for them. But the boats were small, and they may, even at the best of times, going out for 4 days at a time, may hook one tuna, and the rest of the stock was mackerel, and what we would consider in the West to be a little bit of a shitty fish, eating fish, but that's what they caught. Now, what gave me confidence to do this is I am and always have been a very keen amateur fisherman. And in Australia, fishing is a big thing, as fishing is throughout the world. And I'd been brought up with fishing, so I had a good understanding of fishing. I'd also observed in my own country the tuna industry and the fishing industry of other fisheries. And I thought I had a reasonable handle on the basics of what should occur. So the business we'd decided to go into, what I did notice is all the fishermen would sell to what they called brokers. And where we were actually located, there were two other brokers. The fishing boats would come in after 2, 3, 4 days at sea, loaded up with their fish, and they'd come in and they would go to the brokers. The brokers would then give them a price for their fish. They would sell it to the brokers. The brokers would then take those fish and either sell them locally, but the majority of them, because would go to General Santos, especially the tuna. And the tuna was destined for the EU market, but mainly the Japanese market. And they were paid a great deal of money for that tuna. But the way they transported them, I observed, was on little flat top trucks packed in ice and polystyrene foam, and it was so what I consider to be unhygienic, and half the motor vehicles were run down death traps, but that's the way they used to do it. So in essence, what I looked at it and I thought there's got to be a more efficient way to do this. Now this is before I had the discussion. So we sat down and we discussed businesses, and then out of these discussions about different types of businesses, one of the brothers basically said, well, there's big money in fishing. And of course I knew that. So I listened to him and he said, and we had a fishing boat or fishing boats previously, and they did very well. So I thought, okay, they've fished before. And I inquired as to what type of fishing. They actually employed a skipper because, as I said, they were farmers. And they did very, very well until, and the excuse was, diesel went up, because most of these fishing boats are powered by small diesel engines. And what happened once diesel went up is the profit margins in what they were catching obviously went down. And because, unbeknownst to me, the boat that they owned, they'd financed, as they do, and I now know with people in the Philippines, they finance everything here. And of course, when they get behind in the financing, boats get repossessed. And there's no excuses over here as to, oh, diesel's gone up, or, oh, I need repairs. If the payments aren't made, eventually the financiers take the boat. Well, that's at a later date. That's what I found occurred. They got behind. The boat no longer was out fishing. They had breakdowns or something such as that. But they went broke through circumstances I didn't go into. But this was the thing. Here was an industry that I knew, or thought I knew about, in a Western sense, that I could understand, that I could basically learn about and whatever. Here was a business that I assumed that they'd had, and I use the word assumed, knowledge about, So we were looking good. So after a lot of discussion, we decided, and I'd suggested to them this, probably the most lucrative area is for us to transport fish. I didn't want to get too deep into the fishing business, but I did understand the transport business. So I was involved, or we were going to be involved in the fishing industry, and we decided we will buy something that's totally new here, which was refrigerated trucks. 1, 4 tons could be transported. 2, especially the tuna, and that's really all I was interested in. The theory was we would go to all these fishermen that provided the local market with tuna and say to them, hey, we will transport the tuna to General Santos, which is the big tuna market. The fish will be of better quality by the time it arrives. The buyers who grade the fish will pay you more, and we will take a percentage of that for the transportation. In theory, it sounded great. There was a little bit of a reluctance as far as the family was concerned, because they, with their experience, thought there was more money in actually fishing the fish than transporting it. But I convinced them that this would be the best way to go. So we went out and bought the truck. The truck was a considerable investment of around $1 million pesos, which in Australian is $35,000. And we bought that from Dumaguete, and we drove it back, and we set up the truck to transport. What I didn't realise after getting more and more involved in this is the way these particular fishermen work, being subsistence fishermen. It went relatively well for a while, until we started to get requests, because these are fishermen that we don't really know, that we're trying to say to them, give me your most expensive fish, I will transport it, i.e. trust me, and we'll get a greater value for that fish, and you will make more money, and we will make money transporting it. But as I said, Filipinos by nature are mistrustful. And what we were finding is these fishermen were only too happy to give us the fish as long as they could accompany us to the markets and observe what the fish actually sold for. Because everybody else, to a degree, tells fibs, for want of a better word, when it comes to money. So they weren't going to let these strangers come in and take their fish away and say they got X amount, pocket a reasonable amount of profit and only pay them certain pesos. Now that became a problem. If they wanted 1 or 2 representatives to go with them and we had 50 fish on board and you multiply those 50 fish by 2 representatives apiece, obviously we could not transport 50 people just so they can watch their fish being sold. A major problem. So then what had occurred was that we decided to go to them and say, look, elect 1 representative to come along and we will transport them to market. They can watch all your fish. Again, they're mistrustful and they weren't going to do that. Here I have a ₱1 million truck and an inability to fill it. So rather than admit defeat, I said, okay, what we've got to do is become brokers ourselves. We'll pay for the fish before it leaves. Now to do that, I have to build on my property, close to water, an area the fishing boats can actually pull up to and unload their fish. So we set to work building a processing, for want of a better word, a processing plant. Now it's not this big, huge factory type complex one thinks of in the West. It is a small concreted area which has access to water. It's covered, it's usually made of corrugated iron. It has cool rooms which are produced to keep ice there to keep the fish fresh while you're compiling them and then putting them in the truck. Anyway, it is a structure, and again, another $1 million or so goes out the door to produce this. My mentality was, if you produce something that people like to work in, that you will have a greater response from your employees because, you know, it's a good place to work, the facilities are good and whatever. And of course, I went ahead and produced a facility that was to the lower standards of a Western processing area. Became a major mistake. It was money I didn't have to invest, but I felt comfortable in that fact. And then of course it went one step further. Rather than slushing around in filthy shorts and no safety boots, I went and equipped the employees in the factory with gum boots or wellies or whatever you want to call them. And of course it's money, money, money. And to differentiate ourselves between and to raise the standard, again, I've gone off on a tangent, wasn't listening to people and thought I knew better. I decided to deck out our drivers in uniform so they look good, so that the trucks and the signage look fantastic, it was clean, and make it more appealing. And my thinking was to gain a reputation of good quality fish coming from our area, being transported correctly to General Santos, and you know, people would desire our product more and pay more than they would somebody else's product. This was an absolute waste of time, effort, energy and money, because I didn't know at that stage of the game the priority for any business or any consumer in this country is cheap and out of sight, out of mind. They don't particularly care where it comes from, and once it gets on the boat and they wave goodbye to it, it's the end product, how it gets there is of no consequence to these people. So again, I put millions into the processing plant. Then I found out that we started to boom as far as that was concerned. I put my brother-in-laws to be, at that stage of the game, in different positions within the company. I did know enough to put the eldest son into a position, simply because of the Asian thinking, the eldest has the most respect, into a position where he would one day become the general manager of that particular business. And he was responsible for the purchasing of fish and the overall general control of all the employees. Now to get this, at this stage of the game, we had employees. A number of employees, some that would drive the truck because the truck was moving supposedly virtually 24 hours a day, or the theory was that it was going to be working 24 hours a day, coming to and from and going to other fish markets. So that was it. We had drivers, and here you've got to understand this. Very few employees or workers will do things in a solitary sense. What happens is they require an assistant. Now, for us in the West, that's a ridiculous set of circumstances, and that requirement for an assistant or company is such that they will even subcontract out of their own pocket to have somebody there sitting beside them or doing work for them to have this cluster effect, someone to talk to, someone to bounce ideas off, whatever, I don't know. But if you employ one, normally what happens, or it's been my experience, that one or two turn up and they happen to be notified to the bosses, oh, they're my assistants. And they're being paid by your employee, or eventually they'll come around and say, you know, I need that, so could you pay them a little bit of money? So your staffing starts to grow because it appears on the surface to be a small amount of money. You say, look, I don't know the system here. Okay, if that's the way it's done, it's done. My wife's other brother was in charge of transport, and he would do the driving and of the one singular truck we had into the markets and beyond. So the father would, in his position, remembering I spoke before him, when you become a manager, you oversee everything. So to make him feel involved with the business, he became the floating oracle for the business. And he would float around and he would do the odd things and throw his weight around with the employees and make himself feel good and give him a purpose. So here we were. We have the brothers employed, and of course the brothers then direct employment that I happen to be paying for to their wives. But theoretically, everything was put in place. Everyone was working, and we were transporting and whatever. The problem was that I wasn't aware of the mentality of that at that stage of the Filipinos and this labour force that we're employing. I just expected, because I saw the boats go out every morning and come back, and that this would be, apart from of course the full moons phase, which was 4 or so days where no one would go out because the fishing was lousy. So I just expected a constant roll of fish coming in and out, and depending on the fishing, because fishing's fishing, sometimes it'd be a glut, the other times it'd be a desert type situation with very few fish coming in. But I factored that in and realised that across a month we would have a substantial amount of fish coming through. What I didn't realise was that once we started, we had competition which was ridiculous from the other brokers. We were starting to buy fish and obviously eat into their market, and they were willing to buy fish at under market price to try to squeeze us out of the market. So all of a sudden, people were going to the old brokers. So I observed this and I thought, okay, they're undercutting us. We know that they're not selling these fish at the price they're paying for them, just to be able to retain their market. What I also didn't know was that these brokers were the main financiers of their own fishermen. Now that means that they are actually financing the boats to go out. They're paying for their petrol in advance, they're paying for their supplies, they're paying for their ice in advance, and when they come back, with it obviously is deducted out of the profit they make on that, and whatever's left over they give to the fishermen. Having that set up meant that, again, if I was going to compete, I then had to start financing fishing boats. Another added thing I had not considered when opening the business. And we're talking about the problems that Filipino families, and they're all family-owned fishing boats, have external of the business, then becomes your problem. So even though you're financing the boats, they were coming to me for, I've got a problem here, I've got a problem there, I can't go out here, I can't go out there. So this was becoming a major situation. So I decided after a period of time, and after the bill of credit was starting to build and wasn't being repaid because of factors I didn't realise until later, I was starting to get deeper and deeper and more exposed within the business to these fishermen. We'll put that to one side. So more and more money was going into it, but we were turning over. A couple of things I now realised in a business. If you can't view what's going on all the time, while the cat's away, the mice will play. So I was sending the trucks off and they were disappearing for 2 days, or the truck at that stage of the game, they were disappearing into the sunset and doing their own thing, and I was very reliant on the driver and the operator. We had operators in the trucks that actually do the selling to the market to do the right thing, because they were being paid wages, they were employees, they had the parameters of what they had to do, and I was expecting them to go and do their jobs and come back with X amount of pesos. Well, that didn't happen because of what they call here sideline businesses. Little sideline deals they do to their own benefit that make them money but don't make their employers money. We won't go into that, but it's a fact of life here. Again, remember I said, well, the cat's away, the mice will part and play. So I was not getting the return from the fish that we were buying. And even though on paper I knew how much I was selling for, and I knew how much money we were buying them for, it seemed like a simple mathematical exercise, but it wasn't happening that way. And of course, in the West, when you have employers that step out of line, you either reprimand them or you dispose of them. I started with the reprimanding, and of course when a Westerner reprimands, he gets loud, he makes veiled threats, he does these type of things to keep them in line. Wrong. Because what happens then is, even though it doesn't directly affect that particular employee, other employees see it and they become very nervous about the Westerner, and he becomes what they call strict here. It's actually a derivative of strict, and it scares them. So then they start to withdraw labour. They won't turn up. I'm just getting back to something I hadn't finished beforehand. I wasn't aware of the way these subsistence fishermen work. They go out, they catch fish, they come in, and of course then you hand over X amount of pesos for their catch. For them, they've got a pocket full of money. One would expect, because let's make hay while the sun shines, you would get back in the boat and go out and catch as many as you could when the fishing was good, to accumulate as much funds as you could within that month, because it's either famine or feast here. That's the logical thing to do. Well, that doesn't happen here, or it doesn't happen in the area. I'm not going to say here in the Philippines, because my businesses weren't north, they weren't in Visayas, but it didn't happen in Mindanao, in the area I was in, dealing with the level of employee I was dealing with. What would happen was they'd come home, get a pocket full of money, and then revert to the old ingrained situation within the Philippines where they become one-day millionaires. The first thing they do is go and pay off as much of their own debt, which they're constantly in, as they possibly can. Then they give a little bit of money to the wife, and then she goes out and tries to restock with food or pay her debts, because everyone here has individual debt, whether it be debt from the sari store, whether it be that, but they are heavily in day-to-day debt. Then, as a celebration for getting this particular money, unfortunately a lot of them then go and celebrate with other fishermen by drinking and partying, or mainly drinking, but partying and talking. We all know that Filipinos like to talk, and in Mindanao, they like to drink. So they'll sit round and they'll either subsidise other people to drink with them, because it's no use drinking alone, and they'll pay for all that, and they will have a big time for the first night, the first couple of nights, until that money runs out. Now, as a consequence of that heavy drinking, of course, then they feel terrible for a couple of days. It takes them 2 or 3 days to get over it. And then, and only then, they might get in their boats and go out. So as you can imagine, if you're dealing with, let's say, a primitive people, but not, the connotation's not primitive, but for the sake of the argument, a primitive people. This is done, so virtually all your clients are drinking at the same time, and they're getting hungover at the same time, and they're not fishing. So you have a lack of continuity in the loads coming in and out, as well as the competition with other brokers. I think you can see where I'm going with this, and there's other problems which I'll go over. Okay, as I said in another video, the West, and I'm pig-headed, I can fix this. I've got more than enough money to do it, and stuff you guys, I'll show you. You can wander off. The tail is not going to wag the dog. I'll overcome this. I'll buy my own boats, and I'll employ my own crews, and I'll tell them to go out and what to do and whatever. And that's exactly what I did. So now the business has grown from a transport business to a purchasing business to a complete fishing business. So without stepping back from the business and trying to prove to everybody that, you know, I will fulfill what we've started, I won't let you down, I will make this work, I have the capital to do it. What was happening is I was getting sucked into the vortex of businesses in the Philippines. I was expanding too quickly. My wife was telling me, don't do this. The first thing she says is, please don't employ the family. That was probably the first and major mistake. I shouldn't have employed the family, not because I didn't want to employ the family, but I shouldn't have employed them at that stage of the game. I should have employed them after the business had become established, and my employees and then they could take over management roles after the business was established, and I could step back from it. But I didn't do that, because I thought that by employing them, I would have a certain amount of loyalty to me, and they would work hard. My wife was right. I shouldn't have employed the family. I should have got people I was comfortable with, because employing family becomes difficult. If you if you argue with the family and have problems within the business, and the family is there, you're going to have arguments, and they take it so personally. So I had lost control from the start with the family, because they take everything so personally. So, you know, to get the business right, you can't pussyfoot around. You've got to have it done in a particular way, and that usually causes, even with employees, a little bit of resentment. When you deal with family members, it's a huge amount of resentment. So I was a little bit hamstrung as to how delicately I could guide the family unit. But anyway, my wife warned me. I disregarded that, because I had what I thought were the right reasons in mind. The second thing is, don't expand too quickly, just slowly. Within myself, I thought that it left me no option. I had to take these things such as the processing, and then eventually the boats, to keep continuity, to keep the business running. And I invested. What had happened, we started to develop two markets. We're developing, by the way, the two markets weren't paying for themselves, but they were paying more money for fish further inland in Davao and places like, which were further away. So mathematically it made a great deal of sense to also transport the extra 150 kilometres, which now we're talking about trucks that are travelling not 125 kilometres, but close to 300 kilometres there and 300 kilometres back, because the markets in Davao were paying a lot more for fish. Now, to do that, it was suggested to me by my confidants at the stage that we should buy a second truck to cover that particular market. And of course, I looked at it, it made sense on paper, so I went out and bought another truck. And of course, the thing about the Philippines is that usually when you go into something and it's new and shiny, everyone's enthusiastic about that particular expansion, so they get in. And what I didn't realize, it's basically out of curiosity. It's not out of an expanse type thing, how the business can expand. It's, you've got a new truck, I want to use a new truck arrives at a particular fish market, everyone wants to see it, everyone wants to deal with it, it's a curiosity thing. So the feedback you're getting is everything's going wonderfully well. But that curiosity wears off once they see you there every day, and of course, then you just become one of the rest. So it lulls you into a false sense of security. Now, I was expanding at a rate far quicker than I should have in a place like the Philippines. I have 2 trucks now, I have boats, I have the plant. Now, all the brothers are tied up with transport and the plant, so I obviously have to employ skippers and crew to man these particular boats. And the feelers go out, experienced skippers turn up, or so-called experienced skippers turn up to be employed, because unlike the other boats, I am willing to pay a small retainer and a percentage of what they catch. And I think can't be anything better than that. They can even leave their boats at home, they go out and mine. As long as they go out, they get paid, and they not only they get their wages, they get a percentage of the load that they bring in. Theoretically, to us, a great deal. And the boats would disappear, and of course, like all things Filipino, the first few trips, maybe a month's worth, maybe 6 weeks, everything was running swimmingly. The boats were coming in, they were laden with fish, they had tuna on board, and of course, let's get sucked into the spiral. The skippers were coming back. Oh, it'd be even better if we had radios. It'd be better if we had this, we had that, and whatever. And of course, I'm seeing the results, so I'm saying, yeah, sure, we'll equip you with radios, and radios went into the boats. And then looking at it, the way they caught fish, they usually handline it in the area that I was. Now, I know how difficult it is to bring a tuna in on a handline. And even the weights they were using rocks that they were tying to the hand lines and sinking the rocks down. So, of course, that's a primitive way to do it. I'll buy sinkers, I'll buy hooks, I'll buy this, I'll buy that. Now, some of these battles with these tunas on a hand line can take 3 hours. So I thought to myself, okay, I will supply them with game rods and reels, because to be quite frank, they were losing apparently more than they were getting, because it's a difficult task in a small boat to wrestle a tuna, and any fisherman will tell you that it is. I bought big expensive game rods. Then I bought fish finders, all this type of thing. Unbeknownst to me, apart from the curiosity value, they were very, very resistant to any change. They'd been doing the way they fished all their lives. So even though I tried to explain rods, I tried to explain fish finders, and they kept smiling and nodding, the realization came about when I invested in this equipment. It really wasn't being used. I can't get in the boats, go out and observe them. So that was a bit of a faux pas on my mistake. I'm trying to do the right thing. I'm trying to make their lives easier. I'm trying to lift the level of the fishing industry in my area, become more efficient. Well, what I wanted to do and what they wanted to do were two different things. Again, I did not listen. I thought I could steamroller over them and have them do certain things the way I wanted them to do it. This was my policy, and policy is a big thing in this country. But out of sight, out of mind. Then all of a sudden, the business was floating along quite well, but the money was not adding up to the amount of activity that was going on within the business. The Filipinos don't realise that you can look at a business through its books, through its incoming and outgoing, through the dollars and cents, and get a decent picture of the business. If there's any skullduggery going on, they do it in a very primitive way in as far as the shell game. First you see it here, then it's there, and it's not under this shell, it's under that shell. Primitive theft or fraud that can only be, once you get to a certain size, be looked at and suspected and realised after you look at the financials. So we're monitoring the financials, and that even though it all seems rosy, the figures just aren't adding up. Then, on top of that, what's happening is the amount of fish being delivered by our own boats is diminishing. The unfortunate thing is we are looking at other boats and realising they're coming in with large hauls. We're paying for 4 days away. They're still obtaining their salaries, and yet our loads are diminishing. Now, the whispers that go on behind one's back and by the fishermen on whatever turned out to be them laughing at us that we were so gagu, so stupid, so ridiculous to allow them the ease of which they could obtain money from our investment. What was happening is they were going out in the boats, and some were fishing, others were just going out in the boat until we waved goodbye to them. They disappeared over the horizon. Then they went up the coast, came back somewhere on the coastline, moored the boats, went on their merry way, probably took their own boats out, and then came back 4 days later with a few fish and said, look, this is all we caught, but where's our wages? The second thing they'd do is they would go out from time to time. They would get a good tuna haul, and rather than produce it back here where we were going to, say for instance, sell a tuna for 10,000 pesos and give them 1,000 as their cut in the profit of that tuna, they'd realise that if we go out, all our friends and our family have boats, what we'll do is on the way back, we'll have them meet us, and they're using our radios to do so, to set these little cons up. Come out, we'll unload the fish onto their boats, come over the horizon and say, oh my God, to the boss, we didn't have a very good time here, we only got one tuna. But we want our 1,000 pesos and we want our salaries. And of course, I'm thinking, well, that's fishing, until it became obvious that there was skullduggery going on. Once the whispers had gotten back to me and gotten back to the family, and the little scheme was worked out, I'd confront the skippers. Now, of course, I was pissed off, to say the least, and I confronted them, and not too subtly gave them a piece of my mind. Again, this is the ridiculous thing. Rather than taking shame at the fact that they were caught, they resent the fact that you caught them. And then they resent the fact that you, to a certain degree, publicly humiliated them by yelling at them. And not only did it affect them against me, it affected everyone that heard the strict boss yelling at a Filipino. The attitude was, who does he think he is, comes to this country and humiliates a Filipino, you know? So me trying to keep a certain discipline, trying to keep this business together. I was getting deeper and deeper into debt. Not debt as in I borrowed, but debt to myself. Then trying to discipline them to do certain things, trying to change them, was actually causing me more damage than good. Now, that was only one little scam. That was a scam of the fishing boats. Every avenue that came along had a scam going on, where small holes were sinking this big ship. The processing had a scam, whereas someone would get paid permission via the back door to pay overs for a fish. There's these sideline businesses, right, is not just restricted to one, maybe two people. They all do it. They try to figure out a way to extract as much money as they possibly can for as long as they can, from an employer. And because by this stage the business was so diversified with fishing and processing and transport, and most of the activities were out of sight, direct sight on a day-to-day basis, it allowed for scam after scam after scam to take place. Small scams, but added up, it became a huge drain on the business, even down to the transport. And some of the things I didn't realise, without blaming them, is because we were in an area which was, at that stage of the game in Mindanao, there was some trouble and strife in Mindanao, and the MPA had control of the roads. And it was very rare that anyone travelled the roads unless they were commercial. And what was happening was the MPA would do what they laughingly call a road tax. So any truck that came along in the middle of the night, the MPA would come out, weaponised, pull the truck over, and then demand X amount of funds for them to pass. And of course it's very easy to pass over money to a person that's holding an AK-47. So that was a scam even with the MPA. So all of a sudden we have these additional taxes which were draining money. Then I didn't realise the situation as far as the processing was concerned. My attitude was, unless we can buy fish at a particular rate where I can judge how much profit we're going to make, even taking into consideration knowing that scams I couldn't stop were going on, I could at least factor in those scams and still make profit. Because this is a relatively, as we would say, corrupt country, these scams take place everywhere, and it's just part and parcel of doing business. So you can either jump up and down, scream, rant and rave and not do business, or you can factor it into the profit margins, realising that this is a certain amount of leakage out of profits going to take place, and continue on. That was the route, because remember this, the objective was to get a business going. After I handed it over, at least I'd have the excuse if they ran it into the ground. That was your chance. I'm telling you at the start, don't come back to me for money. If you up or stuff it up, that's your problem. That was the thought behind it. So I partied on, and I calculated this and I calculated that and whatever, and even calculated in the lost money still to become profitable. As long as we could sell the fish at a particular, or buy the fish and then sell the fish at a recognised value, I could factor in all those things. I went to the manager, my brother-in-law, and said, this is what, if we can't buy the fish at this price, I don't want it. That was very perplexing to him. If his thoughts were, if the trucks aren't rolling, if the business isn't rolling, if we aren't buying fish, how can we possibly make money? What he didn't realise is I would rather not buy the fish and have an empty truck and not do anything than lose money. So from time to time, when we could buy the fish at the right price, that's when we would transport, and that's the attitude I had. He could not work that out. And what I didn't realise is that when you go into business with a family, okay, technically in the West it was my business and my wife's business, but not over here. It becomes the family business, and the family take great pride in that business and the brag value of having a business. Now, it seems to me, why be pedantic and make a point about, no, it's my business? If the family want to do that, we all know who's running the show. Let them do that. So that didn't worry me. What I didn't realise by doing that is the loss of face that my family would have if they didn't buy off the fishermen at a price that the other brokers were doing. They would lose those fishermen. You know, I thought it would be temporary, but all the business we'd won over from previous brokers were at a risk of being lost if we didn't pay the overs. So I hadn't calculated that. So unfortunately, unbeknownst to me, we're still paying overs for the fish, even though I directed not to buy them. And everyone said, yes, we're buying fish, we're buying. I assumed after the direction that they wouldn't buy fish, and they continue to do so. It wasn't until at the end of the week and whatever, the end of the month, that I went through the books, my wife went through the books and realised we still have a massive downturn in profit. My wife and I sat down, and this stage of the business has been going for 12 or so months, and the pressure was immense, because even though everyone's doing their own thing, every time something goes wrong, they come to my wife. And my wife this was more pressure than she even received when she was working her fingers to the bone overseas, and she said, I can't do this. The pressure is far too great. So I looked at everything and thought, we're not making money. In fact, we're going downhill. Now, rather than go broke, I just got in my head without consultation. One morning, I suppose I woke up with the shits and gathered everyone together and said, okay, today we stop. It was easy for me. It just meant that I was going to lose money, going to lose far less money from that point on than I had been the day before. So, okay, we're going to stop. Now, as compensation of that, because my family members relied on that income, I said, okay, because we're stopping, here's money and here's money, like a severance, so they can get over the next 12 months. It's all finished. The look of absolute shock and horror in their faces was a sight to behold. What I didn't realise is that if we stopped the business, then they would have to go and face the community and tell everybody, oh, the business has stopped. As soon as you stop a business here, they think you've gone broke. So the amount of embarrassment they would have to, which they created themselves, by the way, but this is the Philippines, that I was causing by stopping the business was immense. Again, a big rift appeared in the family unit. And I'm thinking, hold on, I gave you a lot of money to put you through for the next 12 months. What are you angry at me for? These are all things I learned over a period of time that eventually came to the surface as I became more and more aware. That's, in a nutshell. There's a million other things, but it'd go on far too long. Where the business, with all good intentions, and theoretically should have not only survived but flourished, because of things I didn't know, fell apart. And because of a lack of management. So I licked my wounds and I decided certain things. Don't go into a business you can't eyeball at all times, that you can't control, that you have to rely on other people to fulfill duties. You know, it's not money, just money over here. Money helps, but it's the ability to control. So if you can't control it and you rely on other people, don't do it. That's my experience anyway. Now, I hope that gives you an overview of the first business and why it failed. And I hope you take out of it some of the things I suggested to you. Be fully aware when you employ somebody of their financial situation. Ask around. Do they borrow money? Are they in hock up to their eyeballs? This is all reasons why eventually they will turn on you, trying to survive their own lives. I could have got sour, bitter and twisted because I lost millions in that business. But I put it down to my first learning experience, and I took out of that business a number of things that I then knew that I didn't know before. And that was the price I had to pay. And armed with that, I went on to the second business. And we'll tell you about the success or failure of that business in the next video. So guys, I know I look like a talking head. I'm trying to put these little things up to give you something else to look at rather than my head. After I do these videos that you probably have to listen to, I'm going to go out there into the big wide world and take numerous photos and be like a travel log and vlog and make it a lot easier for you to watch these videos. But if you enjoyed that, tune in for the second business, totally different set of circumstances, and again you'll see a pattern, but you also see certain things that you can avoid if you decide to go into business over here. I'm still here, which means that I haven't got on a plane and gone home licking my wounds, and life is looking good for me, even though I'm a lot less in the pocket than I was when I came here. Subscribe, ring the notification bell, thumbs up, thumbs down, and see you in the next video. It's Phil from Phil and Jen in the Philippines. Cheers for now, guys.